Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode. Ironically, this week's episode was recorded back in January after Jess and I had a few months break from recording. So this episode might seem out of season, but feel free to enjoy it all year round.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Women vs. Everything. I'm Jess. I'm here with my lovely co-host Grace, and we have not done this in a little while. We sort of had a bit of an unplanned hiatus. So hello, we're back.
Hi everyone, thanks for bearing with us. I imagine many podcasts have gone on hiatus given the general state of the world, and yeah, we've both had stuff happen in our lives around physical health and families and mental health since September. So yeah, we've just been taking a big breath.
Yes, but we are back and we are very excited to be chatting with you guys again.
Every episode, one of us takes and researches a significant woman from history. We've also had episodes where the person's gender was a bit ambivalent. That person researches the person and their story. They send the dates the person was alive to the other person, which is this week me, and I research the dates, what was generally happening in the world at that time, and what was happening within women's rights, within intersectionality at that time. We sew it all together on air and we hope it works.
Yes, exactly. And this is what's really fun about this, is that in principle, at least, the person who's researching the time and the place and things doesn't know who we're going to be talking about. But in practice, we find we often figure it out from context.
Yes.
Which is fun. There's been some, I think, where one of us has absolutely not had a clue, and there's been others where it's been, which I think includes today's, where it's been fairly obvious from the details provided. But that's all part of the fun. That is all part of the fun.
Yeah, and quite often, like today, I've found the names then of several other women that were doing amazing things at that time, and that maybe didn't get as much attention and appreciation for various reasons. So altogether, we hope it makes a really interesting narrative of the wider picture and one person's story.
Yeah, I think something that's important to mention, and that is going to be important to mention, particularly for today's episode, for reasons that will become apparent, is that we are not being uncritical of the people that we're talking about. We're not glorifying them or necessarily or saying that they were perfect.
And also, another thing we're not is historians.
No, we are so not.
I'm barely a human. So listen, if there's stuff we get wrong, we have a corrections corner. You can email us. We'll tell you in a second how to get in touch with us. Or if you're a historian or you're someone who has more knowledge about what we're talking about today, or you feel there's something you know a lot about that is underrepresented on our show, please reach out. We would love to have you as a guest.
Yes.
And we love furthering our own knowledge as well. So we'd love this to be as interactive as possible. So do you want to tell people where they can reach us, Jess?
Yes, absolutely. You can find us at Women vs. Everything on Instagram, WV Everything Pod on Twitter. We are Women vs. Everything at gmail.com if you want to email us. We are at patreon.com/Women vs. Everything and buymeacoffee.com/Women vs. Everything if you would like to give us money, which you should, because this is a passion project that doesn't pay for itself, and we would like it to start paying for itself sometime, please.
Oh my goodness, yes. It's that's another way you can contribute towards our knowledge, is like maybe we could buy, I don't know, a book or something. The other thing is, if you're a broke ass bitch like me and you can't afford to support on Patreon or Coffee, just like and subscribe us on as many platforms as you can find, and tell your friends about us. And we would love to just love to hear more about you, and love to we really appreciate the support in any kind.
Absolutely, all of that. So Grace, how have you been? How's life?
I don't think there's enough like decibels to capture the true anguish that life has been.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had about 6 weeks where I didn't make a full week in work. Probably got RSV, that respiratory virus that's going around at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a chronic asthmatic, so that was bad news. I ended up in hospital with sprained ribs from coughing so much, which was suspected gallbladder problems. So I was on standby for having my gallbladder removed, which was quite like weird. And yeah, so I'm
That's
just
very scary.
Yeah, I'm just still in a flurry of physio and like recovering in various ways. And yeah, and then obviously being 6 weeks out of work and having these repeated stumbles with my health. You know, it was something, it came in waves, and twice I tried to go back to work and I caught a stomach bug straight away because my immune system was on the floor. Yeah, it just really affected my mood as well, you know.
Yeah, of course, as it would.
Yeah, really glad to be out the other side of it. And I had a really great Christmas with my family and a really lovely time. So I'm super grateful for them. And I'm also super grateful for my queer family here in Cork, because they really stepped up. Like, there was people arrived at my door with food and came and cooked me meals, and
Oh, that's so lovely.
I needed it, you know. Like, so I'm incredibly grateful for them all. Yeah. You know who you are. Yeah, and how's your time on our hiatus, unforced hiatus from the universe been, Jess?
I've had better times, not gonna lie. No, it's been a weird time. Obviously, the UK is plague central right now, so it's all been kind of pretty scary. And in the lead up to Christmas, so everyone I know said it just felt like some kind of Russian roulette with COVID, because everything we did, it felt like, oh, was this going to be the thing where we get it and we have to cancel everything and not go home for Christmas and all of the things. But no, fortunately, my partner and I and our families managed to avoid getting it. So we had a nice Christmas at home, and then we went to see family, which was lovely. We had some family stuff going on, which I'm not going to get into on air, but also we lost our cat just before Christmas. And I'm still in the kind of crying several times a day stage of grief with that right now. So yeah, it's not been the best. But I'm back at work today and I'm getting on with stuff, and I'm happy to be podcasting again.
I really hope we get to meet this year and have a big hug. My rabbit Theo is still really naughty, and I'm currently without a laptop because while I was sick, I dropped one in the sink. And a friend gave me a replacement laptop, which is like an old one that has to be plugged into work, and he ate the lead of that one. So people with rabbits understand. He loves eating chargers, the little shit. But he's my little shit, and I love him. Have you consumed any good media on our hiatus or over Christmas break?
I'm reading an interesting book at the moment. Yeah, I'm reading a book called Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again.
Yay!
Which is really interesting, actually. It's quite short. It's only about 120 pages, but it's all about kind of desire and consent in the age of #MeToo, and obviously from a feminist perspective. Yeah, it's really interesting, actually. So I'm about a third of the way through that at the moment. Oh, have you watched that film, Don't Look Up, that everyone is talking about?
Yes, I have.
What did you think?
I loved it, but I also recognised that it's a very niche sense of humour.
Yeah.
That I think a lot of people would not enjoy, and then because the topic is so emotive, it would have really pissed them off to put that with that. So even when I've been, friends are like, oh, do you think I'd like it? I'm like, I don't know. But then friends with a very similar, that kind of like just very dry, awkward, sarcastic sense of humour, I'm like, you're gonna love it, Yeah.
Yeah. We couldn't finish it.
Yeah?
We watched about half of it and we couldn't finish it. Not because it wasn't good, because it was very well done, but it was too real. And it was just depressing for me. It was at the point of like, okay, we're actually living this, and this is very depressing. Yeah. So yeah, I might be one of those people who can find it funny in a few years.
Yeah. And there's a massive 180 in tone and emotion in the last 10 minutes of the show, as well, which I think a lot of people would have found really jarring.
I did look up how it ends. Oh, you know what I did watch that I loved? Death to 2021. Have you seen it?
I loved it.
Yes, it's so good. It's so good.
And it was also like when I was starting to watch that and I was like, was it this year that happened or last year? Like, it's just the last 2 years have been one big blur of shit.
I know, as we were watching it, I kept going, that wasn't this year, was it?
Yeah.
And then realising that no, it definitely was.
Or I kept being like, but why isn't Black Lives Matters in this? And I was like, oh, that was last year. Like,
That
it
was the year
just...
before, yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying... What have I consumed recently? I watched all of Witcher. I rewatched season 1 and then watched season 2. That was good.
Yeah.
Disney's Encanto. Oh my god.
How was it? I still haven't seen it.
I love it. Oh my god,
Yeah.
I loved it. It's still, for me, Moana is like the top, you know, in the most recent Disney films. But it's a close second. Yeah, it's very good. The music's amazing.
Okay, I'll have to watch it.
Yeah, do you know who does the music?
It's Lin-Manuel Miranda, isn't it?
It is.
Who is also going to be mentioned in today's episode if that doesn't completely give away who we're talking about.
Yeah, it's because as soon as I watched it, I was like, I need to watch Hamilton again. So when I saw your description of who we're doing today, I could not believe it because I've literally been driving around with Hamilton blaring on my car all week.
I love it.
Driving here, was crying to like trying to do the unimaginable song, you know.
Yes.
So, do you want to do the not so big reveal of who we're going to talk about this week?
So yeah, the not so big reveal of who we're talking about this week. We are talking about Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, also known as Eliza, who is best known as the wife of founding father Alexander Hamilton, but actually kind of did a lot in her own right and deserves to have her story told as well. So yeah, Grace, do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of the background and the time?
Yeah. I promise not to rap any of this.
Oh God, please do. It would be
or
wonderful.
sing.
I think that's actually an important point to make on my sources on this one. So my jumping off point for this was very much the musical Hamilton, because I love musical theatre, and spoiler alert, the next person that we're going to talk about that I'm choosing was also inspired by musical theatre. I will give points to anyone who can figure out who it is. Anyway, so that was kind of my starting point, but alas, musical theatre is not a primary source.
Really?
Sadly.
I mean, that'll be our first diss towards Lin-Manuel Miranda today.
As I was going through this, I sort of tried to kind of fact check as many of the things that are said in the musical as I could, to kind of figure out what's accurate and what isn't. Anyway, please tell us more about the time.
Yeah, because my computer's broken, I have papers and I'm going old school, and I'm sure our editor is going to hate me for it, because usually I have it all on a Google Doc, and now I have papers which will make noise and rustle. The dates Jess gave me were 1757 to 1854 in America, primarily New York. The themes were the American War of Independence, loss of a child, infidelity, political sex scandal, philanthropy, and charity work. So I started by looking up what were women's rights like around the pre-revolution time in America. And at the time they were, the same as in England, because British be colonising.
Yep.
They were covered under this thing called the Laws of Culverture, which is literally that a woman's identity was covered by her husband's. Yeah. The woman and man, once they married, were considered one person, the husband, basically. And that's where taking the husband's name when you marry comes from.
Oh, so horrible.
I know! These laws were around since the Middle Ages. So a bit like we talked when we had Eleanor on, you know, women didn't have many rights written in stone, but they were quite active in terms of if their husband permitted them to do it, they could do a lot of things, you know. They could take over the business when their husband was away. They could access education if their husband gave permission, things like that. But as such, as a, you know, when we step outside of individual stories where you might have had a very free-thinking husband or father, the bigger picture was really bleak, that they couldn't own property, including the clothes on their back, you know. So when we talk about women couldn't own property, they could not own things or objects, basically. They couldn't control money, sign legal deals, they couldn't own or control their own bodies, make decisions for their children, or get education without their husband's permission. So there was women doing quite amazing things, but it was, again, it would be documented in the husband's name, or it was individual cases that wouldn't be documented quite so thoroughly. Women and African American men were considered less intelligent than white men. The American Revolution started in 1775 to 1783, and it was initiated by 30 northern colonies against Great Britain because Great Britain was taxing the hell out of their colonies, and there was no representation in terms of politics or having a voice in the British government that was taxing them so much.
Yep.
And the American Revolution is actually like a series of lots of smaller battles that kind of went on. There was a series of acts brought in, Britain kind of doubling down or punishing the colonies for rebelling. And one was 1774, the Sugar Act, which was trying to put an end to smuggling sugar and molasses from the West Indies to America. The Stamp Act in 1765, the British military trying to raise revenue from the very people who were fighting them through the taxation of all commercial papers, newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, cards, and dice as well. The Townsend Acts, 1767 to 1768, was 4 acts enforcing further rule and authority over the colonies. And the Tea Act was 1773, which was to save the East India Company, which was a big part of the British economy. And people found themselves, so a lot of women would have found themselves in situations where they could no longer afford to live under this. They were in dire poverty.
Yep.
And the phrase "no taxation without representation" comes from this time kind of getting all the shitty bits of a government, but none of the benefits.
Yep.
Women did amazing things in the revolution. So they did fundraising drives, supplying troops with uniforms and blankets. They would work in military camps, which I can talk about later, tended to wounded soldiers, made bullets, and women were also left to run and manage the husband's properties and business while their husband was away fighting.
Yep. That's going to come up a little bit later in the story.
They also began making homespun. So what it was, as an act of revolution, the colonies boycotted British goods, which included textiles. So women began making this homespun, homemade cloth, and it became a symbol of the revolution to be making this. Oh yeah, there was a public demonstration of spinning in Newport, Rhode Island, where 92 women gathered at a meeting house and produced 170 skins of yarn. Some women were spies. There's at least one documented case of a woman disguising herself as a man to go to war, which is something we've covered in previous episodes.
Yes, but also, do we know what her name was, and can we do an episode?
I think it's coming up. There's going to be a few women mentioning here.
Fabulous. Love it.
Yeah, and Esther Debert Reed, who's the wife of George Washington's former secretary, she spearheaded a fundraising campaign that raised $300,000, which in today's money is gabajillion.
A lot.
Yeah. Is
many dollars.
A deposit for a 4-bed house if you're a millennial.
Oh God, I hate how true that is.
The women that moved from camp to camp were called camp followers, and
just before you carry on, I just typed it into this inflation calculator to figure out what $300,000 in the 1790s would be worth today. And it's approximately $9 million.
Oh my goodness. 2 4-bedroom houses. So there was women that would go to the camps where their husbands were stationed, and they would just live and work at the camps as well. So they cooked, cleaned, delivered water, they sewed and mended uniforms, they tended to the sick and herded farm animals, milked goats.
Wow, the mental images. Can someone draw us fan art of that concept, please?
They milked goats and foraged for food. So they're essentially running these camps, There's a quote here that says, "Beasts of burden having bushel baskets on their backs by which they were bent double." And, I just also kind of want to say, African American women were doing this all the time, and...
Yeah, absolutely.
They were still slaves and not getting paid for it and not getting any glory for it. So, as much as I commend these women, it's and...
Yep. there's layers to this, definitely.
Absolutely. There was a woman called Mary Ludwig Hayes who took over her husband's position when he was injured, and it's thought she actually served in a couple of battles, and she received full military pension from the government for her wartime service. If you want to look her up, she also went as Mary Pitcher. Deborah Sampson from Massachusetts is the woman who disguised herself as a man under the name Robert Shirtliff, and she got wounded and refused to tell the doctor that she'd taken a musket ball to the thigh, cut it out herself, and sewed the wound back up.
Wow.
To avoid being detected.
Okay, wow. Yeah, we should probably do an episode on her at some point.
She was honourably discharged and also given a pension for her service.
Nice.
I know.
Did they know she was a woman at that point?
Yeah,
or...
she was. Yeah,
Okay.
She was discovered eventually, but like, oh
Okay.
my goodness. Someone who I think we should definitely do an episode about is someone called Phyllis Wheatley, who was an enslaved African-American in Boston. And she took up the pen and wrote poetry, becoming one of the first published female authors in America and the first African-American woman to be published. In 1773, they published her collection of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, and it was popular on both sides of the Atlantic. And it touched on patriotism, human values. It contested that African-American men and all women were of lesser intelligence to white men. But she wrote a poem about George Washington, entitled His Excellency George Washington, in 1775, and she got to personally read it to him at Cambridge headquarters in 1776 upon his invitation.
That's awesome.
I know.
Love it. Yes. Definitely we'll do an episode on her at some point. She sounds fabulous.
Yeah, and she obtained freedom on the death of her master in 1778. So yeah, I tried to see if women's rights improved as a result of the war or after the war, but I think in our previous episode about World War One, like, if anything, war does damage to any movements towards equality.
Yeah.
And unfortunately it's the same case here. Even the future First Ladies didn't have a lot of recognition or rights.
No, or really a lot of control over anything.
Yeah. So Dolly Todd Madison had to fight her dead husband's heirs for control of his estate. And her image is minted on a silver dollar as a tribute to her work in Washington. You know, so it's again this like, you can have these rights but only on our terms, and we'll celebrate you but only if you follow the rules. And so she's, you know, she's done such great work. She's minted on a coin, and when her husband died, she lost, you know, she wasn't given any rights, basically.
Just lost everything.
Abigail Adams encouraged her husband John, who became president, to remember the ladies when drawing up a new federal government that she couldn't be a part of. Although the war drew a lot of attention to political matters and equality, it was a long time before it made any difference to women's rights. Eliza Wilkinson from South Carolina in 1783 wrote, "I won't have it thought that because we are the weaker sex as to bodily strength, we are capable of nothing more than domestic concerns. They won't even allow us liberty of thought, and that is all I want."
Yeah, it was not a fun time to be a woman.
It really wasn't, no. And this person, Judith Sargent Murray, she wrote in 1779, but it wasn't published till 1790, her essay on the equality of the sexes. And she's, I think, the first person to make the statement that the differences in intellectual capacities between men and women were due to prejudice and discrimination and lack of opportunities. And she demanded a view that the order of nature was that of full equality between the genders, and this had been corrupted by men. So this shaming that happened, that women who wanted independence were like against nature or somehow unnatural or something, you know, not real women or feminine. She twisted that and was like, no, you guys are the corruptors of nature. You're the abominations, you know.
Wow, nice.
So that was met with shock and disapproval. Surprise, surprise. The Republican movement of revolutionary politics, its main goal afterwards was to develop intelligent and self-disciplined citizens. And they had this new ideal that there was Republican mothers. And these would be mothers that could instruct their children, particularly their sons, to be intelligent and reasonable. Although that's very problematic, it actually did help because it did bring some significance to the traditional aspect of women's duties. And it resulted in more of a commitment to women's education. but because they could therefore pass that benefit onto their sons and the men in their family. But it did help make husbands and wives more equal in the family in the intellectual realm.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
So slow trickles of women's rights. I wonder how Eliza got on / managed to kind of motivate herself to do anything in the middle of that whole mess.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one because in some ways she was super privileged. So she was born in 1757 in Albany in New York, and both her parents came from very, very wealthy and very highly regarded and politically influential families. So she grew up in this kind of very privileged environment, this very wealthy environment. Even in that context, you know, even a woman who is in a wealthy family who is relatively comfortable and has this relatively, you know, cushy life, really has absolutely no power whatsoever, has very little agency. As we've discussed, they're essentially regarded as property.
Yeah.
So she was one of 15 siblings, of whom 7 lived to adulthood, including, for those who have seen the musical, Angelica and Margarita, who was known as Peggy. She learned to read and sew from her mother, and the family were members of the Reformed Dutch Church of Albany, and she retained a very strong religious faith throughout her entire life. Her father was serving in the army in the French and Indian War, and she was described as a child as being kind of something of a tomboy, so strong-willed, impulsive, those kind of words were used to describe her. I think something that's really essential that we have to acknowledge about her childhood and her upbringing is that her father, Philip Schuyler, owned slaves. He was a very prominent slaveholder in that area at the time, so she would have grown up surrounded by slavery. And her views on that in her earlier years are not very clear. She spoke out against slavery later in life, which we will discuss later on. But yeah, that was very much a function of her childhood, sadly, and that was something that was going on in a lot of the wealthy families, of course, at the time.
So it's like sometimes we talk about the men are at the forefront, but they're able to do their battle so well because the women are keeping their camp together. But then behind those women, there's actually African-American slaves that are holding the entire fucking economy together.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
People's entire ways of lives, because, you know, there's no way you'd have leisure time and time to learn to write and sew and read without free labour.
Absolutely. One of the criticisms that's been levied at the Hamilton musical, which is a valid criticism, is that it overemphasises Alexander Hamilton as an abolitionist, which many historians think is actually an oversimplification and is not actually quite necessarily what was going on. So there's a quote from an interview where Lin-Manuel Miranda states that he agrees that Hamilton was complicit in the system even as he was voicing anti-slavery beliefs. Yeah, I've read different sources on quite what his involvement was. One source claims that he was involved in buying and selling enslaved people on behalf of his in-laws, Philip Schuyler, his father-in-law. Others have said that he really vehemently despised the institution of slavery, but also, quote, really liked having influential friends, and therefore didn't challenge people, including Philip Schuyler and including George Washington. So we don't know quite exactly the specifics of all of that, but there's a lot of evidence that the image that's put across in the show is not really accurate.
Yes, it's one thing to be visibly outspoken about something, and it's another thing to actually walk the walk.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll link to some of our sources in the show notes so people can read more.
Yeah. Watching Hamilton for the second time, my other criticism was like, I wasn't sure it would pass the Bechdel test.
Oh, that's interesting. Does it?
It actually does. It does. But they're very, very short conversations. So Eliza and Peggy talk about the revolution during the song Schuyler Sisters.
That's true, they do.
And they also talk about going away for the summer.
Yes.
But you can disagree with that because during the revolution, they're also talking about finding good husbands. And the Schuyler Sisters song is actually all about like hooking up hooking up with the hot soldier boys.
Yeah, and the bit where they're talking about the revolution, it's also sort of based around like what their dad is doing and what his involvement is and what he thinks of the whole thing.
Oh, okay. So I've just found another opinion piece which says it fails.
Okay. I think if it passes by the skin of its teeth, to be fair. It does not pass very well.
I really don't think it does. So the Bechdel test is a measure of the representation of women in fiction, and it asks whether a work features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. The requirement is the two women must be named is sometimes also added. Only about 58% of movies manage to pass the Bechdel test.
I'm surprised it's that high. There's really only 3 main female characters in Hamilton. There's Eliza, Angelica, and Mariah Reynolds, who we will mention later. Yeah, and no, it doesn't, does it?
No, and they're all centered around their relationships to men. Yeah, I think especially once I found out about Phyllis Wheatley, a woman of colour, who gets to recite a poem about George Washington to George Washington by his invitation, I was like, that should have been a song in that fucking musical.
Yeah.
And it's again where it's like, there was this big movement that it's all actors of color, and I'm like, well, this was someone in history who was a person of color and we don't know her name.
Yeah.
So I don't. Yeah, that's my second criticism of Lin-Manuel Miranda. I don't think his work is feminist enough. Sorry, please keep writing music because it's very good music, but cop on.
So Eliza and Alexander first met briefly in 1778 when Alexander dined with the family on his way back from forming a negotiation on behalf of George Washington. But then they met again in 1780 when she was 22 and she went to stay with her aunt in Morristown in New Jersey. And that was where they reconnected. That was also where she met and became friends with Martha Washington, George Washington's wife, and they remained friends throughout the entirety of their husbands' long political careers. Eliza is quoted as having said of Mrs. Washington, "She was always my ideal of a true woman."
Ooh.
Whatever that means. So they kept in touch mostly by letter, and there was some talk in one letter of a, quote, secret wedding. But they did actually get her father's blessing and they were officially engaged by April of that year. This is interesting. Apparently it's a little bit of an anomaly in that family to get her father's blessing for marriage because at least 2 of her sisters had eloped.
Oh my goodness. Maybe he learned his lesson and was like, she's going to do it anyway.
Maybe. Especially, I mean, we've already said she was described as like strong-willed, so maybe she'd have just gone ahead with it, even if her dad had said no. So they married, and after a brief honeymoon, Hamilton returned to military service, and he was based in New Windsor in New York, which was where Washington's army was stationed, and Eliza joined him there and rekindled her friendship with Martha Washington. But Washington and Hamilton had a falling out, didn't know about that. Mm-hmm. And Eliza and Alexander moved back to her father's house in Albany, and then eventually moved to a new home just near the New Windsor headquarters. This really ties into what you were saying at the beginning about, women kind of working alongside their husbands and doing a lot of the work but not really getting any of the credit.
No.
Eliza was very much involved in helping her husband with his political writing, of which there was a lot. He wrote this 31-page letter to someone called Robert Morris, who was a financier and later would become a senator, in which he laid out a lot of the financial knowledge that would be so important later in his career when he was building the Bank of America.
Yeah.
And parts of that letter are in her handwriting. Yeah. Again, doing so much of the work, not getting anywhere near enough.
It's again, also, I know some people use that thing of like, oh, maybe he was just dictating or maybe she was just proofreading. And it's like, well, these days that would be the equivalent of a research assistant, in which case your name would still get on the paper.
Right, exactly.
So it's like, we're not saying he did nothing and she did more. We're just saying she was a part of it and therefore her name should be on it.
Absolutely, yeah. So sometime around this time, she became pregnant with their first child, who would be born the following January and who they named Philip after her father.
Yeah.
And during this time, Alexander was away fighting with the army, and this was the lead up to the Battle of Yorktown, which effectively ended the Revolutionary War. It was kind of the big win that essentially ended things there. There's a story here that a group of British soldiers stumbled upon Eliza's childhood home where she was staying at the time, looking for supplies, and that her sister Peggy told the soldiers that their father had gone to town to get help, which caused them to flee. So that was what saved the family from any losses. I don't know if it's true. It's one of those, some sources say things, but I thought it was kind of a fun story.
Go Peggy.
Yeah. That's my other criticism of the musical. I wanted more Peggy.
Yeah.
She's in it for like 5 seconds.
Yeah, and even that 5 seconds, she's the reluctant, not as playful one.
Yeah. I mean, admittedly, if all of this was in there, it would be 17 hours long, but...
I would watch 17 hours of a Lin-Manuel Miranda produced musical.
I mean, fair point. Fair point.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. It would be amazing.
This is an interesting story. In 1787, Eliza sat for a portrait with a painter called Ralph Earl, who was in debtor's prison at the time, because Alexander had heard about him being in prison and asked his wife if she would sit for him to allow him to make some money and buy his way out of prison, which he did.
Some level of practicing what they preach, I suppose.
Right, exactly. They had 8 children in total over the course of their marriage. And in 1787, they also took in a girl called Fanny Antill, who was the 2-year-old youngest child of a friend of Hamilton's whose wife had recently died. And she lived with them for 8 years.
That's good that men can just pass off their infant children.
Right, yeah. Why, though? Why did he not look after
because
his
it
child?
wasn't because a man was so accepted to not be able to deal with children. It was like he was doing what was best for her.
So he passed her off, and yeah, she lived with them until the point that her older sister got married and was able to take her in.
Oh my goodness, that's awful.
But by all accounts was treated as essentially one of their own children, so at least she was well
still
treated.
At the point as well where children are treated as property, and especially girls.
Yeah, absolutely. So sad, really, but that was a thing that was, sounds like it happened a lot. So they had a very active social life. They often went to the theatre, they went to balls and parties. Eliza is quoted as saying, "I had little of a private life in those days." That sounds exhausting, quite frankly.
I think it sounds great.
So Eliza, along with 2 other wives of very powerful men at the time, so Sarah Jay and Lucy Knox, were described as, quote, the leaders of official society by an early historian. So on top of all this, she's managing the household. There's a quote here from one of the other founding fathers, James McHenry, who supposedly said to Alexander that his wife had, quote, as much merit as your treasurer as you have as treasurer of the United States.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd believe it, because I mean, it's well accepted he wasn't doing all that. Alexander, he was away so much and working so much. Right,
so she's just doing all of this as well as looking after all of these children. Going back to the whole helping him with his work and his career thing, apparently she served as an intermediary between him and the publisher when he was writing the Federalist Papers with James Madison and John Jay.
Wow.
Which fans of the musical will know he wrote the other 51.
Correct.
And she also copied out portions of his defense of the Bank of the United States, and she also sat with him so he could read parts of the farewell address he was writing for Washington as he wrote it. Like, seriously, this woman deserves credit as a collaborator on all of these works.
It's not like you could say one thing for like proofreading or for like, go on there, I'll have a listen to it and give you feedback. But I mean, to sit with the publisher and be an intermediary, she had to know the fucking work. She had to know what she was representing when she was meeting the publisher. It wasn't just that she was able to fix the final details. She obviously knew the work intricately.
Yeah, she was obviously like really smart.
I mean, I still can't wrap my head around it, so.
Same though. Yeah, so by this point she had 5 children. They would have 8 in total. And they were moving around a lot between New York and Philadelphia and Albany. So in 1794 she suffered a miscarriage. And at that point, Hamilton resigned from public office and resumed practicing law in New York so that he could be closer to his family.
It obviously hit them very hard.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a slight aside, but throughout the musical there's this really interesting thread that suggests that Alexander and Eliza's sister Angelica are kind of in love with each other.
At the very least, an emotional affair.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and historians disagree on whether they were actually lovers or not. There was a letter that Angelica wrote to Eliza in 1794 where she wrote, "Your husband, for I love him very much, and if you were as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a little while."
Oh, there was a line in one of the songs about that.
Right,
Yeah.
it's if you really love me, you would share him.
Yeah, my sister Angelica wants to start a harem.
Yeah, so some historians believe that this was just like banter between sisters, and others believe that they were actually having some kind of affair, at least emotionally, if not physically.
I did wonder, like, from the music, now that you're saying it, the musical very much portrays it as her and Hamilton were met very much in like their wit and their intellect. And is it just that she could meet him in wit and intellect, and it's impossible for male historians to consider that it was a friendship and just a woman could give him back as good as he could, give.
Yeah.
That they just think it's impossible to do that without her being sappy and in love with him.
Yeah. At any rate, they wrote these very affectionate letters to each other, but at the time it wasn't particularly seen. I mean, I think some people kind of believed that there was something going on, but it wasn't seen as particularly scandalous because they were family. He was married to her sister, so that was it almost kind of made it more okay for a man and a woman to be close friends and writing to each other affectionately. However, we know that he was at least capable of cheating because
he was a dirty tomcat.
1791. Maria Reynolds approaches Hamilton asking for financial aid, claiming that her husband has abandoned her. From there on, they had an affair that lasted until around June of the following year, so it was about a year, give or take. And at some point, her husband, James Reynolds, found out about the affair, although some historians believe that it was a setup from the beginning that Maria was in on. Ron Chernow, who wrote the biography that the musical is heavily based on, wrote, "There seems little question that Maria approached Hamilton as part of an extortion racket, delivering an adept performance as a despairing woman."
Interesting.
Whereas others believe that she wasn't in on it. We don't really know for sure. But either way, they extorted money from Hamilton, a total of over $1,300, which is the equivalent of about $37,000 today.
Wow.
According to this inflation calculator that I used. Yeah, it's a wild amount of money.
For sex.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure she's very gifted at what she does, but that's a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, you'd think it would have been better for him to just come clean or just cut it off and call their bluff and blackmail. But
there is also, I don't know if it came up in your research, but some people are of the opinion of, he was this very rich and powerful man, and she was a woman down on her luck, that it was like this power imbalance he should not have taken advantage of, that maybe there was a little bit of extortion from him. I just again have seen people's opinions on that, but
yeah,
I think it's it's a very sticky situation.
Definitely, that's a perspective that's, I think, worth considering as a possibility because, yeah, he was wealthy and powerful, and as we've established, women had very little say and agency in many ways at that time.
Their entire relationship was based on her coming to him saying, like, I'm about to be evicted, please, please can you donate some money? So
exactly. So Eliza didn't find out for a few more years. The affair first came to light in 1797. And at first she didn't believe the charges that had been levelled against her husband.
Oh.
Yeah, but 25th of August of that year, Hamilton publishes the infamous Reynolds pamphlet, in which he laid out the affair in excruciating detail. The purpose, as far as I understand it from the information we have, is that he'd been accused of financial misconduct with James Reynolds and was refuting that by saying, no, it wasn't that, it was this. But effectively destroyed his reputation, destroyed his political career. There's that whole scene in the musical where they're like throwing the pages at him and saying he's never going to be president now. I'm not sure if he ever wanted to be president, but maybe. Who knows?
I imagine he did. He was very ambitious.
He was very power hungry, so yeah, probably.
Can I just say as well, David Higgs is just like, oh my god, he's so hot.
Yes, he's amazing.
He plays Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, when he speed raps, it just does something to me. It's just even thinking about that scene, I'm like, he's actually won a Primetime Emmy for that performance.
Really?
Rightfully, yeah, because
he deserves it.
He really stands out. He just owns that song and every song he's in, basically. Anyway, Alexander is never going to be president now.
So, at the time this comes out, Eliza was heavily pregnant with her 6th child at the time.
They skipped that in the musical. They don't show her pregnant.
They did, that's true. They actually, apart from Philip, they actually say very little about any of the children.
Yeah, or any of her other pregnancies. They mention a sister. Like, there's one scene where Philip mentions having a sister but wants a brother. So I always thought they just had 2 kids. Yeah.
Yeah, no, they had 8 in total over the years. So her initial reaction to this was to leave Alexander in New York and go to Albany to her parents, which was where her son was born in August of that year. She only came back to the marital home apparently because her eldest son Philip had contracted typhus and the local doctor wasn't able to cure him.
Oh.
Although this is interesting because this to me implies that she was very upset and very angry, as you would be. But this other source says that obviously in the show she essentially leaves him, and insofar as a woman in the 1790s could leave their husband. But in the Chernow biography, it states that she was more angry with the people who'd revealed the affair than she was with Hamilton.
Oh no. Oh honey.
Yeah, which is really interesting to me.
You know, when you look at the level of trauma that the woman then must have been carrying, that this idea that their husband, the person who their lives depends on, would hurt them in this way must be so painful. I imagine they probably do a level of denial or kind of scapegoating to try and escape dealing with that, you know?
Yeah. So in the show, there's this song "Burn" where she burns his letters because she's so devastated and heartbroken by this betrayal. So Ron Chernow writes that she did destroy her own letters and some of his, but that her reasons are unknown. So it's not necessarily true that it was an immediate reaction to the affair. One source describes that this framing in the show is essentially a way of, quote, addressing a very real historical ambiguity.
Okay.
Yeah, so she did destroy the letters, but if it was quite in that context, we don't really know.
I mean, what other context would there be?
Yeah, I mean...
You know, the burning of something to do with a relationship when you've been scorned is still alive today, you know?
That's true, that's true.
I don't know why else someone would do that.
It's not clear if she did it then or if she did it later.
Okay.
Obviously, they were public figures, so maybe it was some kind of privacy thing? I don't know. So, I mentioned previously that they had 8 children in total, but before their 8th child was born, they lost Philip, their oldest son. So it was 1801, and this man called George Eaker made a speech in which he essentially slandered Alexander Hamilton. He claimed that he would be willing to overthrow Thomas Jefferson's presidency by force.
Oh.
Yeah, I didn't know that until I was doing the research for this. That's what he said. Yeah,
because in the musical they make it seem like the guy was just slandering him for, you know, being a hound dog.
Yeah.
And in which case I was like, yeah, Philippe, don't defend your father for that. It's the truth, you know?
It's kind of true. No, apparently what he actually said was that.
Wow, that is pretty scandalous, actually.
So Philip and his friend Stephen Price both challenged Eaker to a duel. Price and Eaker exchanged shots, but no one was hurt. But then the following day, Philip faced Eaker, and there's this story that Alexander counselled his son and told him to essentially waste his first shot to end the conflict without anyone getting hurt. And that seemingly is what Philip did, but Eaker shot him. He got shot just above his right hip, and he was brought to Angelica and her husband's house, where he died the following day with both of his parents next to him. And friends of the family say that the family never quite went back to their old selves. They were so devastated, as I mean, you would be, right? Anyone would be. And when their last child was born the following year, they also named him Philip. Yeah, it's really sad. So in 3 years, this incredibly embarrassing public affair reveal has happened. And then she's lost her eldest son in a completely needless way. This woman's going through a lot at this point.
I think I read somewhere, because actually when you Google anything to do with the American Revolution and feminism, every single article that comes up is her.
Yeah.
But I did see that she also lost a sister in that time as well.
Yeah. Her mother had also died suddenly.
Oh, God.
And then Alexander goes and gets himself into a duel. Of course. We know how this ends. 2 years later, so this is really interesting because in the musical, it very much emphasizes that Eliza blamed Alexander for Philip's death. And I couldn't find any info on whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I guess if you take just the general information that, you know, he died defending his scoundrel father, and if Hamilton knew he was going to a duel but didn't say anything and gave him the advice to waste his shot, then, you know, it's easy to surmise if she knew any of that, that's how she might react, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. I mean, like, what... I know they had very different beliefs back then. It was a very different time. But how your son tells you he's going to go and duel someone, how do you say, do it this way rather than don't do it, that's really stupid, you're going to get yourself killed?
Yeah. And I mean, that level of grief mixed in with the cheating alone could be like, just because she wasn't angry about the cheating when it happened, then it's like maybe after all of this, she was just had a delayed like outburst of anger at him for like being a dick.
Yeah. Maybe, which like would be totally fair because he kind of was in a bunch of ways. To be fair,
I think there's plenty of evidence to say she should have been angry with him, blamed him for something.
Yes, exactly. So 2 years later, it's July of 1804, and Hamilton gets involved in this what is called an affair of honour with Aaron Burr, who had been a very long-standing political rival.
Frenemy.
Yeah. Well, the portrayal of them in the show is really frenemies, isn't it? And it does seem like that was kind of the case. Like, they were acquaintances for a long time, and then they had this rivalry going on. And
I imagine that's just what politics is like, you know?
Oh, I'm sure it is. So they were going to have this duel, and he wrote these letters to Eliza before he went. I think he kind of knew that there was a distinct possibility that he was going to die. And spoiler alert, he did. He apparently had told friends and made it clear that he was intending to waste his shot and not kill Burr. But the other men who were there when this happened give conflicting accounts of what happened and of who shot who first. But anyway, the result of this was that Hamilton got shot. He missed, Burr didn't. And he was taken, this was in Weehawken in New Jersey, so it's directly across the river from New York. So he was rowed back across, taken home. And he died on the 12th of July with Eliza and all 7 of his surviving children there with him.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So in this few years, she's had this humiliating affair come to light. She's lost her mother, she's lost her son, she's lost 2 of her siblings, and now she's lost her husband. Yeah. But she lived another 50 years after that. I feel like we should have a whole other musical about like what Eliza did next.
Yes.
As often happened to women, I think, in those days after when they were widowed, she was left with his debts, of which there were many.
Okay.
It's interesting because it's very much, people think of him as very much like a rags to riches story. This one article that I read said that a more appropriate term would be rags to debt.
Yeah, he's that kind of personality that's indeed quite impulsive and kind of like, there was a few comments in the musical about like he needed to have the best clothes and he needed to have like above his station, you know, that's how people get into debt, you know.
Very much so.
I wonder, so women can't inherit the properties, but they can inherit the debt?
I think they can inherit the properties.
Okay.
But I don't know much about how the property law works, but my understanding is that inheriting was one of the only ways that they could own property. So she inherited his huge amount of debt, probably between $50,000 and $60,000.
Wow. Okay.
Which is a lot of money now.
Yes.
I mean, back then, that's like an eye-watering amount of money. She also inherited this house in Manhattan, but that ended up being sold, although later on she was able to repurchase it from the estate. At the age of 76, she resold the house, $25,000, which is about $825,000 today.
Nice.
Yeah. And purchased a townhouse in New York, which is still there and is called the Hamilton Holly House. And she lived there for 9 years with 2 of her adult children and their spouses. And she was also able to collect Alexander's pension from when he was in the army, so that she got money and land that way. And she did a lot in those last 50 years of her life. She did a huge amount. So back in 1798, she'd been invited by someone called Isabella Graham, who was a Scottish-American philanthropist, to join the Society for the Relief of Poor Widows with Small Children. So she got involved with that, and then 2 years after her husband's death, she and several other women founded something called the Orphan Asylum Society, which she was the second directress or vice president of. But then later she was named first directress and served in that role for 27 years until she left New York.
Oh my goodness. The smarts she must have had to run those roles.
So much. So she raised funds and collected items and goods that they needed and cared for children, oversaw their education. This one source says over 700 children.
Wow.
Yeah. And by the time she left, she'd been involved with this organisation for 42 years. And it still exists.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, the organisation, it's known as Graham Wyndham today. but it still exists, and it's a social service agency for children in New York.
Wow. So
Yeah,
real
it's
legacy.
amazing. Hundreds of years later, it still exists.
Okay.
And as a result of her work with this organisation, she was inducted into the philanthropy section of the National Museum of American History, which showcases essentially how early Americans' generosity built and reformed the nation.
Wow.
As we mentioned at the beginning, she also spoke out against slavery in her later years. That was something that she felt very strongly about. I found one source that states that after her father died, she and her siblings freed the remaining enslaved people on the Schuyler family estate, but I couldn't find multiple sources to back that up. I could only find one that stated that, so I don't know how true that is. I hope it's true. She also really threw herself into defending and securing her husband's legacy. There were a lot of critics of Alexander at that point, as you can imagine, and she very much stood up against them. She requested an apology from James Monroe, who had made accusations of financial improprieties, which were the accusations that ultimately led to the infamous Reynolds pamphlet. She wanted a full official apology from him, but apparently he wouldn't give that until they met in person shortly before Alexander died.
Oh my goodness. Like, okay.
Yeah.
She's a bad bitch.
Right, she's just like, how dare you say this? You will apologise. She reorganised all of his letters, all of his papers, all of his writing, and one of her sons, John Church Hamilton, helped with that as well. And she got this biography published called History of the Republic of the United States of America as Traced in the Writings of Alexander Hamilton and His Contemporaries.
Wow.
That is a mouthful, but they got that published.
Good for her.
And apparently she was so devoted to his work that she wore a package around her neck which contained the pieces of a sonnet that he wrote for her when they were courting.
Oh.
I know. Yeah, I mean, again, historians today say that so much of what is known about him historically can be attributed to her.
And he was obsessed with legacy, and she's the one who's got this amazing legacy, you know?
So much.
A lot less tarnished than his.
And she was doing this, like, into her 90s.
I was going to say, she must have been... How old was she when Hamilton died?
48?
Okay, so she could have just retired and gone into a quiet life and...
But essentially, she's best known as his wife, but
Yeah.
she had, like, half her life after he died and did all this stuff. So in 1848, when she was, as we said, in her 90s, she requested that Congress buy and publish Alexander's work, and in August of that same year the request was granted. Congress bought and published many of his works and added them to the Library of Congress. These are some resources that historians still use today.
Okay.
And she's still doing charity work at this point as well. So she finally left New York and moved to Washington, D.C. And while she was there, she worked with two other women. So there was Dolly Madison, who was the wife of 4th President James Madison, and Louisa Adams, who was the wife of President John Quincy Adams. And they worked together to raise money to build the Washington Monument.
Wow. Oh my God.
Yeah, so by 1846, she was suffering from some short-term memory loss, but is described as still vividly remembering her husband. At this point, she'd outlived Alexander by 50 years. She outlived all of her siblings except one. The only sibling who outlived her was Catherine, who was 24 years younger than her. Yeah, and she died in Washington, D.C. on the 9th of November, 1854, at the age of 97.
Wow.
Which is an impressive age now, but dear God, back then...
100 years dedicated to the foundation of this new America, you know?
Yeah.
And she's just remembered as being someone's wife.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so much more.
Yeah.
And that was, you know, really kind of one of the reasons that I wanted to do this one, because I think there is just so much amazing stuff there.
Is her name even on the Washington Monument?
I don't know. That's a really good question.
It's, again, I think it's another area, the fundraising that women do, you know, and then it's, the monument is dedicated to these people, but the people who did all the work creating it and had the idea to honour them in the first place are just not mentioned, you know, and it's usually women.
That is so true. Yeah, so that is the story of Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, who needs a musical dedicated to her.
Absolutely. The real Hamilton.
I mean, I have seen some fans speculate that the musical is just called Hamilton because it's kind of at least as much about her as about him, but it's not, though. Like, he takes up most of the time. And like, I can see what they're getting at, but it is really about him.
Yeah, an amazing piece of work, an amazing musical. Still go.
Oh yeah, it's incredible.
Do it, but it's not a feminist piece of art, you know.
Yeah. So yeah, there we go. That is today's story.
Brilliant. Oh, go Eliza. Fantastic. Well done, Jess. Great choice.
Thanks. And now I want to go and listen to the musical again and sing along to all her songs tunelessly.
Great. So this is where we usually do our basic bitch gratitude list.
I have a bittersweet one, I'm afraid, and I'm going to try not to cry. I am grateful for my kitty, Nyan, because obviously I'm like heartbroken right now because we just lost her, but she was a sweetheart, and I'm so grateful that we got to be her humans for several years. Yeah, and I'm grateful for scientists and healthcare workers, again, for helping us all survive this goddamn plague that is still going on. What about you?
I'm also grateful for vaccines because I got my booster today. Yeah, so we're now a fully vaccinated and boosted podcast. Definitely
Yes.
Not giving you COVID through your headphones. And
if the pandemic is still going on when we're popular enough to do merch, we should make like Women versus Everything face masks.
Yeah, or that's definitely a sticker. No COVID through your headphones. I am really grateful for my financial privilege because just being born into a family who can support me as someone in recovery and who, and now I'm grateful that I'm well enough to work and I can afford physiotherapy, I can afford therapy, I can have a roof over my head. I think I forget how lucky I am because finances can be such a source of stress for me. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But actually, getting by paycheck to paycheck is a luxury that a lot of people don't have today. Yeah.
Do you have a sign off for this week?
No, it's you do the sign
Do
off
I?
because you chose the person.
Crap. Okay. Oh, go on. Do you have an idea?
I was going to say write better feminist musicals.
Oh, God.
Don't come at me.
You know what? Let's go with it. Until next time, folks, write feminist musicals and love women. Bye!
Bye! I mean, if only a sexual scandal could stop people from being president now.
Oh, God. You're so right. You're so right.
Oh.